Welcome back. For the coming 30 or so minutes, Diedrich and myself are going to pick a few of the motives that we have used in to enrich the exhibition that are running. As we have heard a lot already about the whole Earth. Of Californian territory. From our curatorial approach, we had one guiding motive that we used to construct the way we tell the narrative in the exhibition, and that is the motive in German. It's called a Kippbild or Kippfigur, which translates rather not so elegantly in English as multi-stable figure or figure of shift.
Tipping
image.
Tipping point.
Tipping point would be a good connection to Anthropocene discourse, which is mostly about tipping points in nitrogen cycles, climate change, etc. So we have 8 motives in total, which roughly run along this idea of picking different Kippfiguren along the overall narration.
Yeah, and I'd like to start historically with the historical situation that shapes this, or that comes before this moment that we kind of violently made into a motive. But obviously we found this, and the motive is that the whole Earth and the publication of this countercultural magazine or this catalog somehow coincide, by the one using the other as an illustration, although these are cultural objects of very different nature. They're very different types of objects. One is a practice, the other is a maybe ideological image with a certain with a huge semantics, and they are basically they are not as 2 words in a sentence. They are deeply different. But as we've already heard in the talks by Fred Turner and Alex Slade, they've already been kind of illustrated. The universalism of the utopian universalism of the whole Earth image and its reality on Earth, how Alex was demonstrating it, and the dialectical history of the counterculture, how Fred was describing it. And I think we have to think about those components: the countercultural, the idea of a counterculture, and the idea of a universal kind of restatement of universalist ideology as before the historical background of the Cold War period. And the Cold War period is normally seen as a period of a clear distinction between East and West, between 2 different worlds. But if one looks closer, especially if one looks at it from today, the commonalities between the 2 sides are also very strong. And maybe one can even deduct the counterculture from the fact that it was somehow realizing and experiencing the commonalities between the 2 sides. That was its main point, and also that this was also maybe a point that the 2 countercultures that Fratelli has spoken about shared. That was maybe the thing why it was possible to speak of a counterculture, of one counterculture for such a long time, because this one counterculture, although, and I would agree with that diagnosis, being composed of 2 different things, leftists and communalists, shared the perception of the commonality of the two sides in the Cold War. And what are these commonalities? Well, on both sides agreed on technological progress as a major aim, as a major goal of how societies should be built. Technological progress was out of the question, and it was not only an empty term, it was filled with very similar specific ideas. So on both sides you had something like a military-industrial complex. On both sides you had a certain concentration of power in hierarchical male organizations. Well, that is maybe still very general. One can say that that progress also as a notion was what Luhmann would call the unit of distinction between the two. Both also agreed in ruling by systemicity, were interested in developing ruling methodologies that were no longer based on humans, but based on, for example, cybernetical, or not for example, but on cybernetical categories or cybernetical concepts. Both were very interested in a black box behaviorism that was a widespread development also on both sides. Both sides introduced space travel, and both sides had a certain idea of welfare, and one could even say the Fordist compromise existed on both sides of the so-called Iron Curtain. And it's interesting that avant-garde movements, maybe the forerunners of counterculture, so the first artist movements that were more than just artist groups, but artist groups that attempted to act politically or become a political force, their main goal, their first goal was the technocratic component of their societies. They were not at first anti-authoritarian, they were first anti-technocratic. One just has to remember, for example, that the Gruppe Spur, the German section of the Situations International, who were also kind of the forerunners, some of their members became the founding members of the Subversive Action, which became later the German SDS, so the heart of the German student movement in '68. They, in the late 50s, their enemy was Max Bense, so a kind of cybernetic aesthetician, or someone who was interested in the cybernetic idea of aesthetics, because they saw in him the technocratization of art. And so that I think is the starting point of countercultures. As also Fred has shown with the anti-punch card demonstrations in Berkeley. But the main feature and quality of those movements that existed between, let's say, 58 and 64 was that they did not know of each other. You had them in all over the world. You had them in Paris, in Vienna, in Brussels, in Copenhagen, and of course also for example, in Tokyo, in Buenos Aires, and other parts of the world, but they did not know of each other, although they developed some very similar concepts. And so coming together, meeting other people, was far more attractive than it is today, where it is bureaucratized by social media. It was really an unbelievable, unheard of thing that you could meet similar spirited people elsewhere and come together. So this was a kind of it is probably forgotten how much that was needed. And so the other thing was you didn't only have no access in 1958 or also in 1962 to like-minded people in other parts of the world. You also had, of course, no access to the so-called tools. You had no access to information, books, records, and things like that. So it is very interesting that there have been so many. There was a lot of hope into male, later male art, into male order. Youth culture magazines of the 60s, before the whole Earth catalog, had long mail order lists. And I remember from provincial Germany in the early 70s that the reason to buy a subculture magazine was that there were all these long mail order announcements, mail order advertisement. And of course something like a German phenomenon 2001, 2001, was of course something like a commercial German version of the whole Earth catalog. Although this specialized in culture, of course, and not on that kind of, not even claiming that these objects could be used in a farm or in a Buckminster Fuller dome, but the objects were not so different. And so I think this is an interesting, these were the interesting conditions on which the whole Earth catalog and the image of the whole Earth, the planet, were perceived. And then the two are in a way contradicting each other. The idea of a counterculture and of going to the country and leaving the city is an act of separation. And but the whole Earth its semantics is the notion of coming together, or the notion of not being able to get elsewhere, having only this one planet, being condemned to love each other, kind of it becomes normative that you have to love each other because you are with these people. And so it's interesting, you have to be there, you have to love this planet. On the other hand, you just realize that you want to get away. And so what happens in the counterculture is an act of separation, but the rationalization, the discourse of legitimation of this act of separation is that the separation is in the heart of the mainstream society. Mainstream society is alienated. You are alienated in it, and that means you are separated from whatever is the true nature of human beings or communal life. So it's a separation of separation that is proposed by the counterculture, and that is, I think, something that is still true for both countercultures. This act of separation, whether you do it by critical means or whether you do it by an exodus that very quickly becomes a very pragmatic idea of exodus. And maybe you continue that.
The first motive I wanted to bring up, I'll be quite brief. It's basically concerns two convergent scenarios of planetary management that have defined the prehistory to the blue planet history at which we will arrive. The prehistory that we identified in the exhibition's narration as standing under the sign of that other universal icon, the nuclear mushroom, in itself a dialectical picture, at least insofar as it is both a continued claim to universal power of Western civilization after the catastrophe of the Second World War, and a sign, a threat, a kind of catastrophic apocalyptic image concerning the whole, the entire planet. Now, one specific wall in the whole systems section of the exhibition contains a montage between two scenarios that have become ways of relating to the planetary future embedded in computerized calculation. And one of them has certainly become slightly more successful insofar as it concerns the present. The first one is Buckminster Fuller's idea of the world game, which is very much, and what Fred had not mentioned out of time reasons only, because it plays a major part in his book, is that the first intellectual under which the whole Earth catalog universe is developed is Buckminster Fuller's universe. He is sort of always opening the catalog until that role is taken later by Gregory Bateson and his ideas of a planetary immanent consciousness. Buckminster Fuller's world game, I will be very brief about it. The idea was to, at one point, embed it into a computer and subject the entire planet to a form of management that is based on the premise that there is enough resources for everybody. Only distribution has to get out of the hands of the evil ideologues and into the hands of the comprehensive designers, which basically means intelligent cooperation. So the first model, the world game, is a scenario for cooperation or collaboration, and it is called a world game because it is a gaming structure in which those person loses, that means is left with nothing, who induces conflict. War, for instance. The second parallel idea of a computerized relation to the planetary present and future is Hermann Kahn's war game. So world game on the one hand, war game on the other. That's also a game. It's game theory, something that has also certain roots in the Berlin of the 20s. The crucial difference here, Hermann Kahn, as some of you may know, is a futurologist and one of the key figures in the famous RAND Corporation, that think tank that has defined much of the Cold War strategy of United States government, and is one of the role models for Dr. Strangelove. Several of his books concerning nuclear scenarios for nuclear war are displayed in the exhibition. Hermann Kahn also appears in Stuart Brand publications. He's one of the interesting figures, and that's also something that Fred Turner has referred to. He is one of the figures in which the separation between counterculture and the military-industrial complex, that kind of antagonism has never existed to the degree that one likes to think of it. Now, the war game of Hermann Kahn is based on calculations or models of how to calculate the behavior of your opponent. So it's together with his other branch of scenario building, in which Stuart Brand later will become involved, scripting scenarios in a narrative form in order to explore a field of options and make them also more likely. So there's a magic twist to most scenario building. In what we have seen, the long boom, for example, is very much this kind of, if we act according to that scenario of the long boom, the likelihood of this to happen will increase to that and that degree. Now, basically, the crucial point of the war game is that it is based, and its algorithms today are based on competition. They're based on the opposite, on the inverse, and this is where the two enter into this quite interesting different framing conditions of dealing both with the management of a planetary now, and which in Hermann Kahn's case is pretty much what has happened in terms of the algorithms embedded in most automated transactions, such as financial transactions today, and competition and collaboration are in these two models become the inverse of each other.
I'll say a little bit about tools, since it's a term that it's a subtitle of the whole Earth catalog, access to tools, and it now is it's even as an English word it is used in German, and it is some kind of an abstraction of different things that, if you use it in German, which were for maybe a good reason not the same thing for a while, like Werkzeug or Mittel or Instrument, or maybe tool is just a translation of that. The question, how I'm still interested. I'm still referring back to the distinction of the two countercultures, and I think that the tools question is a very interesting point where they where precisely they become two, and on the other hand where they also could still hold up the illusion that they are one. So at the first stage, you can say if you look at the co-presence of a new left, the Black Panther movement, and hippies, and people who found communes, and they maybe have often similar behaviors, or there are people who haven't joined one or the other, but are in between the two, and are part of a behavioral, sociological commonality. It basically, the distinction between the two is the distinction between pragmatism of acting, of doing something, which the going to the country, build another world, and the critique of ideology, which seems to say we have first to come to terms with what we are in. We have to. It's not Prometheus, but Epimetheus. We have to first think and then act, and we have to think about strategy, and we have to think about who we are and who we collaborate with, and what is right or wrong. How can we just start building things? What would be the basis of that? And the basis of that is separation, and the other basis is that we can do it, but this is all very lofty and nebulous. So the concentration of the ideology of pragmatism there, of being able to just start, is obviously the tools, because everything else is not really clearly defined. So there's a burden of proof for those who don't want to be involved with critique of ideology any longer, is the tools themselves. But what still both of these groups share is the language of liberation and revolution. These are still a terminology that is applied by both sides. And ask myself, how is this filled? With what kind of experience is this filled? Well, there was, I think, one powerful term that I think also both groups could agree upon. That was being conditioned, and the kind of utopian counter idea to decondition yourself. You were conditioned. That could mean ideologized, being subjected to the ideological state apparatus, if you would describe it from a leftist perspective. But it could also mean you're so closed, you are so straight, you are so narrow. It could also be in a spiritual or even in a cool talk. You could talk about being conditioned. So deconditioning was, I think, a powerful notion that both sides could agree upon. And of course, there was also a pragmatic experience, a psychologically powerful experience, and that was the experience with authoritarian people. Authoritarian people were first clearly conditioned, and they were constantly trying to condition others, and they were not aware of that. So here, critique of ideology, and so the easy, accessible proof of a pragmatic act Both helped a lot against the authoritarian phony. Stefan Brecht, in his great book Queer Theater, makes this distinction in the mid-60s between two people who are left in America. One is who are still there in America. One is the authoritarian phony, and the other is the free person. So being a free person was something that both could relate to. Now, what that is interesting is the example of Ken Kesey, the famous scene where Ken Kesey, that Fratana mentioned, this where Ken Kesey is playing the harmonica and singing Home on the Range instead of marching to Vietnam. When I was first reading this, marching against Vietnam, of course, against the Vietnam War, when I was first reading this description that famously Tom Wolfe gave in his electric Kool-Aid acid test, in my useful leftist mind, I thought, not okay. This is a critique of the leftist movement. Ken Kesey is criticizing the leftist movement. He's doing something against the leftist movement. He's calling a demonstration their game. He's speaking of it's only their game. I thought this is further left. This is a more sophisticated, more intelligent, more future-oriented left that even breaks with the whole language of classical so-called democratic politics. Because I couldn't imagine that something like that would not come from a leftist position. But back to the tools that then would become so important. First, it's kind of it's strange that a movement that we all thought of as agreed upon a critique of consumerism produce a catalog where you are invited to buy objects, where you become a consumer. But of course, the tool is not a consumerist product. It is defined in the Whole Earth catalog as something that is cheap, although it is very useful. It is not widespread. It is new, and so on. It helps. It is defined as helpful in education, and so on. So it is defined as something which is not a consumerist product. So what is it then? Obviously, it seems to be something like use value, pure use value. The Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth Catalog dreamt of the possibility to proclaim use value instead of exchange value. Well, that is not so un-leftist. It's basically, I think, the core of Marxism. But it wasn't seen that way. It wasn't seen as a part of politics. It was seen as a part of. We are already beyond politics. So the most ambitious thing we can do if we reach the stage after politics is just to start produce use value, and that's what they try to do. And to end this little meditation with another Whole Earth Catalog project, Whole Earth Catalog-like project. 3 years before the Whole Earth Catalog, two people who were more or less active in the Fluxus movement, George Masunas, of course, and Henry Flint, but who both thought of themselves as communists. They produced something like the Whole Earth Catalog, a bit smaller, and not a magazine, just a kind of little leaflet, or I don't know, it has 8 pages or something, and that's called "Communists should take over cultural leadership," and it has a list of devices that communists need for that, and just like the Whole Earth Catalog describes where to get them. The devices are, the first thing is something that Henry Flint calls street Negro music, and he's saying this is not African music, this is not folklore, and all you communists who are so much into folklore, forget about it. This is something else, this is something better, and it's something that communists need, street Negro music. The second thing are Buckminster Fuller architecture. This is something that we also need as communists to build new worlds. The third thing is prefabricated Soviet architecture modules. The fourth thing is prefabricated architectural modules designed by Georges Messiunas. The next thing is the Citroën Deux Cheveux. It's a great car, it's cheap, and communists can use it. An electric guitar, Les Paul, Gibson, an amplifier, and a keyboard.
I'll take up the cue of deconditioning, which has become the universalization of conditioning, both as modulating milieus, designing shops, up to the big question, what about the climate and how to control the planet? Now, deconditioning, I think, has a lot to do with another of the paradigms that became a horizon to agree upon beyond the established factions and antagonisms. Unframing. Unframing both as something, without me going now into the details of this, that has happened simultaneously around the late 60s to the 70s in terms of becoming a paradigm in art history, but unframing much more with relation to the image of the planet and its the kind of temporality it constructs and the long somehow arrival of its message that seems to have come from outer space to us to finally take hold of the planet in 1990s globalization. We have in total only 3 images, so this is not going to be a lengthy presentation. Can we get the image? That is very blue, but it's not quite the right blue. As for those who have seen the exhibition, have probably noticed one of the call it moves, if you will, is that we are trying to embed the narrative of counterculture within a longer history of what one could call the frontier. Now, the basic kind of morphology of that is the linear turning into the circular. And that is, on the one hand, the line of the horizon that was the horizon of the frontier beyond which there was the further west to... Yeah, now we have it. Beyond which there was the outside of the not yet conquered, wildness, uncivilized wildness and savages. And as that reaches the shores of California and the frontier closes, the moment of which is around the end of the 19th century, gradually the frontier transforms. It doesn't stop. And it's still out there in many different forms, only that these forms have become increasingly difficult to trace. Now the very basic move is the space age directs the frontier into the outside of space. And nobody has even thought of the power of the image of planet Earth, aside from Stuart Brand. who starts in 1966, that campaign, why haven't we seen an image of the whole Earth yet? Space age gaze was totally directed to other planets, which was also an unframing move. No? Other planets as that most powerful metaphor, not least in music, for other worlds, for crossing conditioned boundaries. And the 2 years after Stuart Brand in 1966 on an acid trip has the vision that this image would create what Fred has referred to, that change in consciousness into universalizing a particular consciousness and in its spirit unifying the planet. That image is slowly seeing the light of the day, and it's really that turn from an outward gaze to 180 degrees shift, which seems to have a paradoxical, if you wish, message from the outside telling us that there is no more outside. This condition has basically not been solved. You can try to forget that this message comes from the very place of which you, metaphorically speaking, should get rid of, that outside. But it's incredible how the sort of, if you wish, anti-Cartesian program of that message has really formed a horizon around which all kind of agreements could be crafted, and which also, this image that we see here has this incredible capacity to kind of disappear from a particular history, showing a kind of planetary condition outside of history, and de facto moving beyond the Cold War framework. It shows a planet on which there is no Cold War. That becomes a very powerful move, I think, in the sense of we also know that it immediately is taken off the military-industrial war confrontation, in which it was a symbolic gesture, becomes an icon of the environmental movement. But that kind of militancy in its use is also quite short-lived, although, of course, not in each instance, but just when we think that I think it was already in 71 or 2 that Nixon proclaims it's time to make peace with nature, which is one of these messages of re-inscription, of interiorization, of finding one's place within a circular, ecological, cybernetic, planetary condition, which is basically that sort of crafted around the agreement that everything that was evil was the creation of that artificial divisions which are embodied in the Cartesian subject, the end of which an image like that announces. Now, one thing that I just wanted to point out is that articulates that quite strongly in the exhibition is a film that was made in the early 80s, but refers to an earlier text by the astronaut Russell Schweickart, who made that film in the early 80s as part of a peace movement, of an anti-war activism. And the film is called No Frames, No Boundaries. No Frames, No Boundaries is a phrase that he spoke in awe when out there on a spacewalk, crossing the orbit rather fast, not very far out, and not seeing the boundaries, not seeing the conflicts out there. It's simply too far away. But also ridiculing these boundaries at this very moment in this oceanic awe. No frames refers to Earth floats out there in borderless space. No boundaries is simply that he doesn't see that Cairo, New Orleans, the differences. We are all one. It's pretty much what Kubrick in his kind of cybernetic psychedelic vision at the end of 2001 already pre-dreams. Here it becomes an astronaut's statement on what is the message of that 180-degree shift. Now, that is, of course, a quite interesting Kippfigur, because no frame is, of course, also the biggest frame. And it doesn't lead, as we know now, to the abolishment of boundaries, but, if you will, to their becoming sort of embedded ever more into a planetary interior, being everywhere. The boundaries just multiply. In a way, you could say that's what universalized. After basically the last of these walls that embodied the last remain of, in a quite symbolic, metaphorical connection, the Iron Curtain, the Berlin Wall, was somehow the monument to a Cartesian subject. That after that was gone, this dream of the integrated systems that could finally rid themselves of these remaining boundaries could become the mandala brief for 90s globalization.
I just pick up on two things, the role of music in that, and also the term of the boundless interior that you already mentioned. I mean, indeed, music has, certain forms of music have been read at the same time as representations of an boundless soul and a sublime exterior, for example, space. The German sociologist, musician, artist, and writer, critic Hans G. Helms has demonstrated how Schönberg, when he started to compose post-traditionally, atonally, or in the 12th dodecaphonically, and he had to look for lyrics in order to base the music on something. He needed text for that, otherwise it wouldn't have worked. There would have to be some anchor, and the text, what could they talk about? Well, space. That was the only possibility to make that meaningful, to talk about space. But the reason was, of course, the reason to compose this music was to talk about the soul. And this is, of course, something that we find again and again in conceptions of artistic progress or artistic shifts, paradigm shifts, revolutions, that you can only talk again about the soul if you are kind of expanding it, if you are conceiving it anew as some unlimited territory, just like space. And then, of course, it's the other thing I would like to pick up is the if you're saying about the direction of colonization being colonization having no longer a direction when there's only one Earth left, and the colonization becomes a colonization of the interior. When so to speak, the space colonization remains there as a metaphor, but doesn't take place in reality, whereas what takes place in reality is that this other thing, which is just like space, the soul, that can be colonized. That's something that people find out during neoliberalism, that the soul is available for surplus value production. Outer space, not already. Maybe this can be exchanged in the future, and the soul can be left in peace, and outer space can be colonized. But so far, capitalism has decided for that. And this is something we have also a wall, a narrative in the exhibition that is called Boundless Interior, and that is pretty much about the cybernetization of the soul, about how New Age thinking, new spiritualities, imported religion collages have been used to introduce the circular, the karmic circle, the like nice, soulful spiritual metaphors that describe something that sounds much colder and rational in cybernetics into the self-understanding of the, well, first the experimental Californian psyche and later the not so experimental anymore global psyche as an important component of introducing and stabilizing a psychology of people who are willing to and identifying with letting their energies, letting their self, letting their identity to be used as a resource of production of all kind of immaterial or post-material labor.
The cybernetization of the soul had one particular place that I guess many are familiar with here in Big Sur called Anselm, where the human potential movement did all kind of forms of exploring and measuring out that interior in its boundlessness through therapies, encounter groups, meditation. It was also in a strange kind of frontier context. You could think of it as a coastal node through which, at the limit of the terrestrial geographic frontier, post-World War II, a large import of Asian spiritualities was funneled into California, quite transformed from what they mean and are in their places of origin in many cases. But what I just wanted to add to Diedrich's description is, maybe in the danger of oversimplifying it, but I somehow believe that in fact everything that was done at Anselm since '62, probably until the late 70s, when the place went into a sort of crisis that only in the 90s it started to revive under slightly different paradigms. Everything that was done at Anselm could be broken down to sort of one formula, saying we are one. We are one among each other, with the planet, with the universe. We just still have to realize it. Realization means different things. On the one hand, it's an act of consciousness, and drugs was the crucial gateway to that realization, or meditation, or similar technologies of the interior. But very importantly, relating to decondition, it was also the armors of the old disciplinary ego, of the authoritarian character, of a specter like the fascist persona, the armors that held us back from being one, that needed to be dismantled. So one of the kind of why the idea of deconditioning and the kind of cybernetic neo-animism that emerges through drugs in its combination with cybernetics as a means to unify the planetary, forgetting on the way for the very reasons of the existence and and the methodology and politics of separation. One of the most viral ideas was crafted in Anselm. The very same idea in the 90s applies no longer to the boundaries of that walls or armors of the ego or of the self, but to capital.
Yeah, and to maybe follow up this image of the planet with another image of the planet. This is one too far. Well,
I'm
not the next one.
I'm really sorry, it is so dilettante.
Yeah, we don't know anything about these machines. They were created by Stuart Brand and his people.
Can we get help again?
Has someone a landline here? No, I mean, yes,
here.
There it is. Okay,
Cool.
The flutes, yeah. I want to say a few words about the music in the show and in the exhibition, and the first is the very pragmatic and very quick application, understanding of the icon in question by Columbia Records, who at the same time put this image together for releasing all kind of compilation albums, all kind of music that they had in their catalog, and this music could all be classified as blues, but one half of the musicians was either British or white North Americans, the other were African Americans. So at that time, there was still in radio stations and in the music business itself kind of racial segregation translated into names of genres, but also radio stations and all this was racial segregated. So you had R&B shows that were devoted to music by African Americans, and you had other stations that were devoted, they were called folk, and you wouldn't hear anyone singing there who was black. So this was the reality, and then CBS sold just like one traditional folk blues singer, African American, then a British blues rock band, then another maybe contemporary blues rock musician from the US who was black, and then so it was black, white, black, white, black, white, and this was exemplified, or this was illustrated by this. So they understood immediately what was the main point, or one of the main points in social reality, why there was not a whole Earth. Because why the Earth was not whole, the Earth was not whole at that time, and so what was in one way kind of a reaction to things that racial politics changed at that time, or seemed to change, or could have changed. And on the other hand, that this was around to bring these two together in an act of, I would say, sarcasm, realism, utopianism that is very, very bizarre and unique. And I wanted to say a few things about. Some people have asked how could pop songs be indicative of something, of some kind of social relations, cultural developments, historical shifts. They are only products of some kind of cultural industrial logic. So they respond, and they do not initiate, or they do not create. And I would argue that it's the opposite. That there are a few songs that we use in the show that are, for the first time, in the historical moment, articulate one of those connections, context that we talked about in the show before they've been before any cultural criticism has seen this. And one would be for example, "The End" by The Doors, which in 1966 says this is the end, and at the same time, can you picture what will be so limitless and free? So our major, our central idea with this show that the closing of the planet and the opening of the boundless interior in which you are, quoting Jim Morrison, lost in the wilderness, happens simultaneously at the same time. This is something that only Jim Morrison articulated, not intellectually, not theoretically, but he made this observation. And of course, we have a lot of Jefferson Airplane in the show, because Jefferson Airplane were also, I think, a band who cannot easily be classified as belonging to one of the two countercultures. We have their song "We Can Be Together," which is one of the very few statements of hippie culture against private property, where it clearly anti-capitalist stands, which the anti-communist Stuart Brand wouldn't go with. All your private property is target for your enemy, and your enemy is we. This is one thing, but on the other hand, they also are, they have these fierce these ecological things, but they also have a song, The Farm, where exactly that happens. Exactly this, it's about this going on a farm and using the tools from the Whole Earth catalog. So, all kind of very much to the point of the ideological tipping point, always articulating this very strongly. But of course, not the most important, but maybe the most drastic criticism of the entire Californian ideology, of the entire complex we're talking about, the complex from the Whole Earth catalog leading to contemporary Silicon Valley, has been articulated again by a song that we have in the show, which is California über alles by the Dead Kennedys from 1977, a song which condemns hippie culture as a regime of power that maybe the metaphor Jello Biafra is using this song is not very subtle. He compares it with fascism. But the enumeration of his criticism, the sarcasm, your kids will meditate in school, and going to until even the album cover or the single cover where you have an image of a Nazi Reichsparteitag, but instead of swastikas you have smileys. That is of course something that hasn't been articulated. This criticism hasn't been articulated by anyone. Not only not that drastic, but not at all. Long before the first people got the blues or got yeah.
I think I'll just leave it here. No, maybe one little thing that just refers to something that, for those who may be interested, will come back in autumn, where we will have a day to discuss universalist schemes from the Bandung perspective, sort of that path that is missing or increasingly went missing in the a whole kind of interesting relation. But one thing that also will be discussed in autumn is what that meant for exhibition culture. And I'm just dropping this one little thing here. In 1989, there is the famous exhibition, Le Magicien de la Terre, in Centre Pompidou in Paris. One of the shows that, together with the Primitivism exhibition in MoMA, led to an entire shift in thinking through the universalism of art history, and led crucially to a critique of its colonial implications, as well as to the contemporary art paradigm and its global signifiers that we have today. Benjamin Buchloh wrote or had an interview with the curator of the exhibition, and how did he call the Le Magicien de la Terre? The Whole Earth Show.